The day Karen fined me $500 was the day she unknowingly destroyed her own authority. It wasn't the money that bothered me. It was the smirk. She stood on my porch at exactly 8:03 a.m., clipboard tucked under her arm, wearing that perfectly pressed HOA polo like it was a badge of power. Without even greeting me properly, she handed over an envelope stamped in bold red letters, "Final notice. $500. For unauthorized exterior modification." I stared at the paper. The violation? A small wooden pergola in my backyard. Not visible from the street. Not blocking anyone's view. Not mentioned in the community guidelines. But apparently, according to Karen, it required pre-approval documentation. "You installed it without submitting Form 27B, she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. I kept my voice calm. "Show me where that's required." "It's implied under Section 4.3, she replied smoothly. Implied. Interesting word. I read the notice carefully. Payment due within 7 days. Late fees applied after 10. Possible lien review after 30. She wasn't just enforcing a rule. She was escalating. $500 seems excessive, I said evenly. Karen tilted her head slightly. Rules maintain property values. There it was again. That rehearsed line. Property values. As if everything she did was for the greater good. She turned and walked down my driveway without another word, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I could have written the check. Most people would have. That's how minor abuses of power survive through convenience. But something about her tone bothered me. Not just strict. Selective. I went back inside and pulled up the HOA guidelines. Every section. Every clause. I searched for Form 27B. It existed. But it referenced visible street-facing structural additions. Mine wasn't visible. Which meant one of two things. Karen misunderstood the rules. Or Karen was choosing when to apply them. Both possibilities interested me. So instead of paying the fine, I sent a formal request for clarification. I asked for the specific clause, the visual documentation proving visibility, and the board vote record approving the penalty amount. No emotion. Just paperwork. The next morning, I noticed something unusual while taking my trash bins out. Across the street, behind Karen's perfectly trimmed hedges, I saw it. Something that absolutely required approval. Something far more obvious than my pergola. And definitely visible from the street. That's when I realized something important. Karen had just handed me leverage. And she didn't even know it yet. The structure behind Karen's hedges wasn't subtle. It wasn't minor. And it definitely wasn't invisible. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. A large detached shed stood at the back corner of her property, freshly painted to match her house, with a sloped metal roof and decorative trim. It was positioned just far enough behind her tall hedges to avoid immediate attention from passing cars, but from the right angle, especially from my driveway, it was clearly visible. Very clearly. I stepped back inside and grabbed my phone. Took a photo. Then another from a slightly different angle. Then one from the sidewalk. Visible from the street. No zoom required. Now here's the important part. Section 4.3 of the HOA guidelines, the same clause she referenced when fining me, specifically required pre-approval for any exterior accessory structure exceeding 120 square feet, visible from any public vantage point. A detached shed absolutely qualified. Especially one that size. I pulled up the HOA approval archive online. Every approved exterior modification was logged there with submission dates and board decisions. Pergolas. Fences. Solar panels. Even mailbox replacements. But no shed under Karen's name. Not in the last 5 years. Not under her address. Not at all. Interesting. There were only two possibilities. Either she received approval and it wasn't recorded, or she never requested approval. Given Karen's meticulous enforcement habits, I doubted the first option. Still, assumptions are dangerous. So I did what she did to me. I documented measurements based on visible dimensions, comparison to fence height, estimated footprint. Everything neat, organized, neutral. This wasn't revenge. This was verification. That afternoon, I received an email response from Karen regarding my clarification request. It was brief. The board has reviewed your inquiry. The fine stands. No clause citation. No visibility proof. No vote record. Just authority. That confirmed something. She didn't expect resistance. And she definitely didn't expect counter-research. The next step wasn't confrontation. Not yet. Instead, I drafted a formal compliance inquiry addressed to the full board, not just Karen. I attached 3 photos of her shed. I referenced section 4.3 directly. I politely asked whether the structure had been pre-approved and, if so, requested the approval documentation for transparency purposes. No accusations. Just process. Then I hit send. And waited. Because if Karen believed rules preserved property values, they were about to preserve consistency too. The board didn't respond immediately. That told me everything. Normally, HOA emails were answered within hours, especially when it involved fines. Karen was known for fast enforcement and even faster reminders. But this time? Silence. 24 hours passed. Then 48. No clarification. No documentation. No denial either. Just quiet. Silence in an HOA usually means one of two things: they're building a defense, or they're hoping the issue disappears. Mine wasn't going to disappear. On the third morning, I received an email, but not from Karen. It came from the HOA secretary. Your inquiry is under review. The board will discuss it at the upcoming meeting. Interesting choice of words. Under review. Not resolved. Not already approved. That meant they were checking records. Which meant they weren't sure. Later that afternoon, I noticed movement across the street. Karen was in her backyard, speaking to a contractor. I watched discreetly through my side window. They walked around the shed, gesturing toward the roofline and foundation. Measurements were being taken. Adjustments discussed. That confirmed it. She hadn't expected scrutiny. And now she was scrambling. That evening, a revised email landed in my inbox, this time from Karen directly. Your pergola fine remains active. However, the board is currently verifying historical records related to accessory structures within the community. Historical records. That was the closest she'd come to acknowledging it. I smiled. Because once verification starts, fairness follows. And fairness is uncomfortable when you've been selective. 2 days later, a notice was posted for the upcoming HOA meeting. Agenda item number 4, Accessory Structure Compliance Review. It wasn't labeled with names. But it didn't need to be. Neighbors had started noticing the quiet tension. One even casually asked me during our evening walk, "Is something going on with the board?" "Just clarification," I replied. That's the thing about enforcement. Once you apply it unevenly, it attracts attention. I wasn't interested in embarrassing Karen publicly. I was interested in precedent. If she expected $500 from me for a non-visible pergola, what would she expect from herself for a visible detached shed? And more importantly, would she apply the same standard? The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. Plenty of time for documentation. Plenty of time for reflection. Plenty of time for her to decide whether consistency mattered more than pride. Because the rules weren't the real issue. Selective enforcement was. And once that question is raised, it doesn't go back to sleep. Thursday night arrived heavier than usual. The community clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Word had spread quietly over the week. When agenda items include compliance review, people get curious, especially when fines are involved. Karen sat at the front table with the rest of the board, posture straight, expression controlled. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. At least not at first. The meeting began routinely. Budget updates. Landscaping contracts. Security camera maintenance. Then item number 4 appeared on the projector screen. Accessory structure compliance review. No names listed. Just policy language. Karen cleared her throat. Recently, questions were raised regarding visibility requirements and prior approval procedures for accessory structures. Neutral tone. Professional delivery. But the tension in the room was obvious. She began reviewing section 4.3 aloud. The same clause she used to fine me. She emphasized the phrase visible from any public vantage point. Then she paused. The board has conducted a review of past approvals, she continued. I remained quiet. This wasn't about theatrics. It was about consistency. Karen shifted slightly in her chair. It has come to our attention that one structure within the community may not have a documented approval on file. Murmurs rippled across the room. One neighbor raised a hand. Which property? Karen hesitated for half a second too long. Then she said it. Mine. The room went silent. Not shocked. Just attentive. She continued quickly. The structure was installed several years ago. Records from that period are incomplete. As president, I should have ensured proper documentation. That was careful wording. Not an admission of violation. But close enough. The board's attorney spoke next. Given the current interpretation of visibility standards, the structure does qualify for review. There it was. Qualify for review. The same process she applied to me. One homeowner asked directly, will a fine be issued? The room felt smaller. Karen's jaw tightened briefly before she answered. Yes. The policy must apply equally. The amount? $500. Exactly what she fined me. No discount. No exception. No historical leniency. Just policy. For the first time since this started, I saw something change in her expression. Not anger. Recognition. Rules don't bend around titles. They bend around documentation. After the vote, the board officially recorded both cases, mine and hers, for compliance resolution. My pergola was deemed non-visible and the fine was rescinded. Hers remained under formal review. The meeting adjourned quietly. No applause. No drama. Just precedent. And precedent lasts longer than pride. The official notice arrived 2 days later. Not by email. Not quietly mentioned in a meeting. But in a sealed envelope delivered the same way mine had been. $500. Due in 7 days. Late fee after 10. Lien review after 30. Identical language. Identical formatting. Identical consequence. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. The board posted compliance summaries publicly after each meeting. Transparency had suddenly become a priority. What surprised me wasn't the fine. It was Karen's reaction. She didn't argue. She didn't send clarification emails. She didn't cite incomplete records. Instead, she submitted payment within 48 hours. That told the community something powerful. The rules weren't optional. Not even for the president. Neighbors began talking, not maliciously, but thoughtfully. The narrative shifted from conflict to consistency. For years, enforcement felt personal. Selective. Sometimes sudden. Now it felt documented, balanced, predictable. And predictability builds trust. A week later, Karen knocked on my door. Not with a clipboard. Not with a notice. Just herself. She looked composed, but less armored than before. "I wanted to inform you personally," she said, "that the board has officially rescinded your fine." "I saw the minutes," I replied. She nodded. "And I've addressed mine." There was no apology in her voice. But there was acknowledgement. "That's fair," I said simply. She paused for a moment before adding, "I should have reviewed my own file before reviewing yours." That was as close as she would come. And it was enough. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about equilibrium. After she left, I walked into my backyard and looked at the pergola that started it all. It stood exactly where it had before. Unchanged. Quiet. The difference wasn't structural. It was procedural. In the following weeks, the HOA updated its submission portal. Clearer instructions. Automatic confirmation emails. Publicly viewable approval logs. Small changes. But meaningful ones. One evening, during a neighborhood barbecue, someone joked lightly, "Guess we all double-check paperwork now." Laughter followed. Not tense. Not bitter. Just aware. Karen moved through the crowd calmly. People still respected her. Leadership hadn't collapsed. It had matured. Because authority that survives scrutiny becomes stronger. Not weaker. The $500 fine wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what it exposed. And what it corrected. In HOA communities, reputation travels faster than official notices. Within weeks, the story stopped being about a pergola or a shed. It became something bigger, something quieter but more powerful. Fairness. Before the incident, most residents treated fines as unavoidable annoyances. If you received one, you paid it. Challenging it felt pointless. The board always seemed confident, organized, and united. But confidence without review creates distance. And distance creates resentment. What changed after the meeting wasn't just policy, it was perception. Neighbors began reading the guidelines more carefully. Questions during meetings became more detailed. When new proposals were introduced, residents asked for clarification before voting instead of after. It wasn't rebellion. It was engagement. And engagement shifts dynamics. Karen continued serving as president, but something in her leadership style adjusted. Her emails became more thorough. Citations included exact clause numbers. Attachments referenced approval records. Fines, when issued, came with photographic documentation. No more implied language. No more assumptions. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message from a neighbor 2 streets over. He had been fined for repainting his front door without submitting color samples. "Do you think I should just pay it?" he asked. That question alone showed the shift. Before, people wouldn't have asked. "Check the guidelines first," I told him. "If the rule applies, comply. If not, ask for clarification." That was the balance. Not defiance. Not submission. Process. A few days later, the fine against him was reduced after review. Proper documentation had been missing. Not maliciously but carelessly. Carelessness shrinks when accountability grows. I realized then that exposing Karen's violation hadn't weakened the board. It had stabilized it. Because selective enforcement breeds quiet hostility. Consistent enforcement builds reluctant respect. Months passed. My pergola became ordinary again. Karen's shed remained standing, too properly documented now, officially compliant. Neither structure mattered anymore. What mattered was precedent. And precedent doesn't disappear. One evening, while collecting mail, Karen crossed the street toward me. "We're drafting updated compliance guidelines," she said. "Would you be willing to review them before release?" That was new. Collaboration instead of control. I considered it for a moment before answering. Yes. Not because I wanted influence, but because I wanted continuity. Fairness shouldn't depend on confrontation. It should depend on clarity. And clarity only survives when people participate. The $500 fine had started as an assertion of authority. It ended as a correction of it. Reviewing the updated compliance guidelines wasn't dramatic. There were no heated arguments. No tense meetings. Just documents, track changes, and careful wording. But that quiet process revealed something important. The new draft eliminated vague phrases like implied visibility and board discretion. In their place were measurable standards, clear height limits, exact square footage triggers, documented review timelines. No room for interpretation. No room for selective enforcement. Karen sat across from me at the clubhouse conference table as we reviewed the language line by line. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't dominating the conversation. She was listening. "That clause needs specificity," I said at one point. "Otherwise it becomes subjective again." She nodded and made the edit without hesitation. Months ago, that suggestion might have been dismissed as resistance. Now it was refinement. The difference wasn't in the rulebook. It was in the posture of leadership. When the updated guidelines were released to the community, they were accompanied by a transparent explanation. The board acknowledged the need for clearer standards and consistent documentation. No one referenced the pergola. No one referenced the shed. They didn't need to. The origin of the change was understood without being repeated. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was steady but calmer than before. Questions were thoughtful instead of suspicious. Votes were informed rather than automatic. Engagement had replaced frustration. And engagement feels different. It feels collaborative. After the meeting, Karen approached me briefly. "You handled this without trying to embarrass anyone," she said. "That wasn't the goal," I replied. She gave a small nod. "It could have gone differently." She was right. I could have exposed the shed publicly before confirming documentation. I could have rallied neighbors aggressively. I could have turned a policy issue into a personal conflict. But escalation creates noise. And noise rarely creates structure. The real power wasn't in catching her violation. It was in documenting it properly. Because documentation forces reflection. Reflection creates adjustment. And adjustment sustains authority. As I walked home that evening, I realized something subtle but meaningful. I wasn't viewed as the person who challenged the board. I was viewed as the person who clarified it. That distinction matters. Because communities don't function well under constant opposition. They function best under balanced accountability. The $500 fine had started as enforcement. It became equilibrium. And equilibrium is quieter than conflict. But stronger. By the time spring arrived, the $500 fine had faded into neighborhood memory. But the effect hadn't. Something subtle had shifted in how decisions were made. The board no longer rushed enforcement notices. They cross-checked records before sending warnings. When residents submitted forms, they received confirmations and review timelines within 48 hours. Predictability replaced intimidation. And predictability builds trust. One afternoon, I noticed Karen walking the neighborhood with a clipboard again. For a brief second, I wondered if old habits were returning. They weren't. She stopped at a property with overgrown hedges and knocked politely instead of issuing an immediate notice. I overheard part of the conversation as I watered my lawn. "We just need a trimming within 2 weeks," she said. "If you need more time, email me." No threat. No citation first. Just communication. That's what accountability does. It moderates behavior without removing authority. The board elections came up that summer. For the first time in years, more than one resident ran for a position. Not because of outrage but because involvement now felt meaningful. Karen ran again. And she won. Not unanimously, but fairly. That said more than any apology could have. Because leadership tested by scrutiny becomes either defensive or disciplined. She chose disciplined. A few weeks after the election results, she stopped me near the mailbox cluster. "You never actually told me why you didn't just pay the fine," she said. I thought about it for a moment. "It wasn't about the $500, I answered. "It was about precedent." She exhaled softly. "I see that now." That was the first time she'd said it plainly. I nodded once. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad it ended the way it did." "So am I," she replied. And I believed her. Because the real cost of that fine wasn't financial. It was reputational. Authority built on unchecked enforcement erodes quietly over time. Authority corrected early survives longer. The pergola still stands in my backyard. Her shed still stands behind her hedges. Neither was removed. Neither needed to be. The only thing dismantled that year was selective power. And that's harder to rebuild once exposed. If you had walked through our neighborhood a year later, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. The lawns were trimmed. The houses were painted. The rules were still posted on the community website. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, everything had. The $500 fine that once felt like a power move had quietly rewritten the culture of enforcement. Not through rebellion. Not through hostility. But through documentation. That's the part people underestimate. Most conflicts escalate because someone reacts emotionally. They argue. They attack. They personalize. I didn't. I read. I documented. I asked for clarification. And when I found inconsistency, I addressed it the same way it was addressed to me through process. That's what made it impossible to dismiss. Months after the incident, a new homeowner moved into the community. During one of our first conversations, he mentioned that he'd heard our HOA was surprisingly fair. I almost smiled. Surprisingly. Fairness shouldn't be surprising. But sometimes it takes exposure to create it. One evening, as the sun set behind the row of houses, I sat beneath my pergola and thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I had written the check immediately, nothing would have changed. Karen's shed would have remained undocumented. Future fines might have continued selectively. Convenience would have preserved imbalance. Instead, a single fine became a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable. But necessary. Karen still serves as president. The board still enforces rules. Violations still receive notices. But now every notice includes evidence. Every fine includes citation. Every decision includes record. Authority didn't collapse. It matured. And that matters more than winning. Because the goal was never to embarrass Karen. It was to ensure that no one president or resident stood above the same standard. The $500 wasn't the real issue.
The real issue was consistency, and consistency protects everyone. So, if there one thing I learned from that envelope on my pouch, it is this: when someone used the rules against you, didn't panic, don't lash out, read them carefully, because sometimes the strongest response isn't louder, it's document. And once fairness is written into the record, it stays there.